What kind of man was this strutting, shouting fanatic of the Third Reich? If anyone really knew Adolf Hitler, surely it was his own family. Here is Adolf Hitler's sister today. Her name is Paula Wolf. Let her speak. I quote her. When we children played together, my brother Adolf was always the leader. All the others did what he told them to do. They must have had an instinct that his will was stronger than theirs. Father wanted Adolf to become a government official as he was himself, but my brother could not make up his mind. He wasn't the type to sit all the time, and therefore, as a government official, he would not feel at home.
Born in 1889, Adolf Hitler grew up in Linz, which was the provincial capital of Upper Austria. But Hitler harbored a dream of living in Vienna, the true capital of German Austria, an unrivaled center for excellence in architecture, art, music, and culture. By 1906, Hitler's father had died, and his mother was incurably ill and suffering terribly from cancer. She was undergoing the most extreme attempts to cure her disease. And despite his mother's precarious position, the young Adolf was determined to make a name for himself in the sprawling Austrian capital. He was recorded by his friend Kubizek as living in the 6th district, in the flat of an elderly woman, Frau Zacharies. Hitler was determined to gain entry to the School of Architecture in Vienna's Academy of Art. He was absolutely convinced that he should pass the entrance exam quite easily. But when the news that he had actually failed the exam reached him, it struck Hitler like a bolt from the blue. In October 1907, with his tail firmly between his legs, he returned to Linz, where his mother was now on her deathbed. And on December the 21st, 1907, Clara Hitler died. Hitler was obviously distraught over the death of his mother, but Hitler's friend August Kubizek gave a moving and melancholy description of her funeral procession, which took place on Christmas Eve of 1907. He said the black-clad Hitler, pale and gaunt, carrying a top hat under his arm, stalked solemnly through the streets of Linz, leading a small band of mourners.
Up until 2012, the graves of Hitler's mother and father were both located in the little churchyard at Leonding, near Linz. They survived both world wars and the whole of the Nazi era. It's important to recognise there was nothing grand about them. They were very modest in comparison to many of the other graves, even in that churchyard. However, graves in Austria are rented, and a decision was taken to give up the lease and destroy the little memorial.
Hitler was entitled to his mother's small widow's pension, but he rather unselfishly assigned his portion to his younger sister Paula, and in 1908 he returned to Vienna, where he planned to work hard to gain admittance to the School of Architecture. Hitler did not make the move to Vienna alone. Hitler begged and cajoled his friend August Kubizek to join him. And the plan was for the two friends to provide mutual support and companionship to enable Kubizek to attend the music conservatory, while Hitler studied hard to gain entrance to the School of Architecture.
The Reichsrat was a fantastically weird institution. It was completely devoid of decorum, functionality, or even common sense. It permitted its members to speak in any one of the 10 official languages of the empire, but made no attempt whatsoever to translate the words of the speaker or to impose a universal lingua franca on proceedings. The result was often chaos, which on occasion descended into the lowest kind of farce imaginable. Proceedings were further disrupted by the frequent use of the device of the filibuster, under which a member could drone on interminably in Italian or Russian, sometimes for days, in order to prevent the reading of a bill supported by the German faction.
There is a bizarre example of a Czech speaker named Lissy who actually ate a ham sandwich and sipped cognac to give himself energy during a pointless exposition of interminable length, delivered merely to prevent the business of the House from moving on to other matters. While outraged citizens who had fought hard for democracy hurled insults at him from the public gallery. Hitler was witness to such scenes, and not surprisingly, they coloured his views of democracy for the rest of his life.
The seed of an idea began to germinate in the mind of the young man that democracy could be dispensed with. And from that moment onwards, Hitler believed that a dictatorship was the only form of effective government. Hitler's friend Kubizek was a fine musician who easily won his place at the Vienna Conservatory and was soon immersed in the whirl of student life in Vienna, making extra money by playing the cello and the viola, and even taking on music students himself. Hitler, by contrast, was simply hiding from reality. Kubizek eventually discovered that his friend was actually playing a daily charade in which he merely pretended to study. Forced to come clean, Hitler admitted that there was no real prospect of him gaining entrance to the School of Architecture. He was too proud to admit it, but Kubizek noted that his friend was obviously close to penury. At this difficult juncture, Kubizek found himself unexpectedly called up to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army, which Hitler so detested. This drove Hitler to apoplexy. Hitler attempted to persuade Kubizek to flee to Germany and invade his call-up that way. But eventually, Kubizek saw sense and reluctantly returned to Linz to face the music. Fortunately for Kubizek, he was only called upon to serve 8 weeks as a reservist, leaving him free to return to Vienna in mid-November 1908. But on reaching Vienna station at the designated day, Kubizek was dismayed to find no sign of Hitler ready to welcome his friend back to Vienna. The realization slowly dawned on Kubizek that without giving his best friend any form of notice, Hitler had moved on into the depths of metropolitan Vienna, leaving no forwarding address. Kubizek was baffled and naturally expected his friend to resurface at any moment. But for Hitler, the world had turned once more. It was almost as if he had simply closed the chapter of Kubizek. The reason for Hitler's abrupt departure from Frau Zachary's modest apartments appears to have been acute financial embarrassment. Hitler seems to have run away from the situation and attempted to make a completely new start. From this point onwards, the exact narrative of Hitler's stay in Vienna becomes impossible to piece together. Hitler found himself friendless and alone, and without any trade or reliable means of making a living. Hitler claims he struggled to survive in Vienna as an unskilled laborer.
We know that on 16th November 1908, Hitler dutifully paid all of the remaining rent he owed to Frau Zachary's, and he moved to Felberstrasse 22. That was door number 16. And his police registration records that his new landlady was Helena Riedel. He lived there for about 9 months, but not necessarily as a lodger with even his own room. He may well have been a glorified Bettgehetker. Now, Bettgehetker were poor people of no fixed abode, often shift workers from the countryside, and they paid a small fee for the use of a bed in a private house just for a few hours. In 1910, it was estimated there were 80,000 Bettgehetker in Vienna. And this form of hot bedding was regarded as a threat, obviously, to health and the morals of the host family. Hitler then moved on from Felberstrasse in August 1909, but that appeared to have exhausted his available budget. and he was soon reduced to living in men's shelters for the homeless. And there remains a strong possibility that he may even have slipped further. And as he said in Mein Kampf, he'd experienced for himself the very worst of what Vienna had to offer.
During 1908, from his own account, it would appear that Hitler had undertaken a series of hard manual jobs to earn what little money he could. With his thin and frail figure, he was clearly unsuited to manual labour. As a building site labourer, Hitler claimed that he had refused to join a trade union when ordered to do so. He was chased off the site by threats of violence and drew the ominous conclusion that all such threats be met with counter-violence. Hitler's disgust with his own wretched state in Vienna was soon projected onto the city he had once admired. Hitler despised the racial melting pot which he saw around him, and eventually this loathing coalesced into a venomous hatred for the Jewish race. Vienna did not mark the onset of Hitler's anti-Semitic politics. However, what we do know from the pages of Mein Kampf is that it was in Vienna that Hitler began to form his own vicious brand of ultra-anti-Semitism. It was now that he came up against the evidence of what he called the Judenfrage, which can be translated as either the Jewish question or the Jewish problem. According to Hitler, the whole downward curve of world history in the 20th century that led toward the final solution appears to have stemmed from a single sudden momentary realization. He described the world-changing moment when passing through the inner city of Vienna, he encountered a figure in a long kaftan wearing black side locks. Hitler records his first thought as, "Is this a Jew? Is this a German?" Hitler said this chance meeting led him on a journey of discovery, as he called it, as he researched deeper and deeper into the Jewish question. This self-study course was conducted in libraries, in cheap cafes, and from the pages of penny pamphlets. The warped conclusions drawn by Hitler, combined with his experiences in the Great War, were to result in worldwide misery and ultimately the death of millions.
Hitler began to buy pamphlets and books and to study everything connected with the Jews. The more he read, the more it seemed that Hitler's own prejudices were confirmed. In his eyes, the charge against Judaism became much more grave as Hitler discovered the extent of Jewish influences in the press, in art, in literature and the theatre. In Vienna at the time, it was possible to purchase a wide variety of virulently anti-Semitic pamphlets, and even newspapers, including the notorious Ostara. Ostara was described as the newsletter of the blonde and the masculine, published by the Völkisch mystic Jörg Lanz, also known as Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels. It was purported to promote an occult worldview based on an outlandish racial struggle begun in a remote past.
Hitler saw evidence of the conspiracy everywhere he looked. It was on this basis that Hitler declared himself happy to know for certain that the Jew is not a German. Hitler had now identified Judaism his arch enemy. Hitler maintained it was futile to try to win over such evil people with argument. He had drawn the conclusion that their very mouths distorted the truth. By late 1909, however, he was now working independently as a postcard painter. He used watercolors to make individual postcards of Vienna's landmark buildings. This living was a very poor one indeed.
Hitler still comforted himself with the faint hope that this was nonetheless a step in the direction of the architect's profession to which he still aspired. Peddling postcards was not as physically exhausting as mending roads, and according to Hitler, when he came home in the evenings, he was no longer dead tired as formerly, when he'd been unable to look into a book without falling asleep almost immediately. Hitler now painted in order to earn his daily bread, and studied because he liked to do so.
As Hitler's circumstances slowly improved, he was able to leave the world of night shelters behind him, and he was ultimately able to transfer to the comparative luxury of the new model men's hostel at Mendelmannstrasse 27. It was among the most modern of its kind. It was lit by gas lamps and was heated by a modern steam heater. There was also a reading room with a supply of daily newspapers and a library. Each of the 544 residents was allocated a small cabin of his own, measuring 5 foot by 7 foot. According to police registration files, Adolf Hitler lived in the dormitory for 3 years. Hitler himself has provided no details about his daily life in Vienna, but several of his co-residents later published their recollections of Hitler's stay in the dormitory.
The best source is the memoir written by Reinhold Hannisch, a vagabond and part-time labourer who became an enemy of Hitler's and died in Buchenwald in 1937. His recollections were posthumously published in the New Republican in 1939. Hannisch recalled how in 1909 Hitler had no winter overcoat and how in his thin jacket he shivered with cold and was blue and frostbitten. He was not earning enough for food, and in the evening, according to Hannisch, he was sometimes reduced to living on horse sausage or the like, given to him from the kindness of his fellow down and outs. It was a miserable life, and Hannisch recalled how he once asked him what he was really waiting for. Hitler answered, "I don't know myself."
According to Hannisch, Hitler appears to have been something of a dilettante. He was a very slow worker and easily distracted. Hannisch frequently had to lecture him on the need to speed up his output.
Eventually, a dispute arose between Hannisch and Hitler. The last time Hannisch met Hitler was in August 1913. In 1937, when Hitler was in power, Hannisch was arrested and sent to Buchenwald. Sometime later, the public was informed that Hannisch had died in Buchenwald concentration camp after a sudden illness. According to the official report, he had died of pleurisy, which had developed in just 3 days. It is no surprise that Hannisch disappeared so conveniently, as the Nazi authorities were understandably apprehensive concerning the possibility of publication of the Hannisch memoirs.
In May 1913, Adolf Hitler was a 23-year-old living rough in Vienna. After 5 fruitless years in the city, engaged in the unsuccessful pursuit of a new life, he was embittered, destitute, and homeless. According to his own account in Mein Kampf, Hitler moved from Austria to Germany for what he later described as political reasons. However, on all of the available evidence, it appears he may actually have moved for a combination of economic and personal reasons connected with his desire to avoid further misery, and more importantly, the looming prospect of compulsory service in the Austro-Hungarian army. The move to Munich got off to a good start, and they soon found lodgings in the city with the family of Herr Josef Popp, a Munich master tailor. Herr Popp lived in modest circumstances, and Frau Anna Popp in particular seems to have quickly developed something of a soft spot for Hitler, the man she dubbed the Austrian charmer. Hitler soon developed a cordial relationship with the Popps, and Hitler was at last living in the embrace of what he described as a true city of the Reich, and he considered this pre-war sojourn was by far the happiest and most contented time of his life.
It's important to note that in Mein Kampf, Hitler claims to have moved to Munich in 1912, while all other sources, including the police records in Vienna, still point to him being a resident of Vienna and living at Mendelmannstrasse until at least the 24th of May 1913.
Writing in the pages of Mein Kampf in 1924, Hitler markedly described his reasons for moving to Munich from Vienna as political. But there's a strong suspicion that the move may actually have been in search of a better life. There is certainly strong circumstantial evidence that the move was connected with Hitler's desire to avoid compulsory service in the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg army. Hitler was a subject of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his age group was due for compulsory military service in 1913. The suspicion that he was a draft dodger grows even stronger when one considers the passage in the book The Young Hitler I Knew by Hitler's friend August Kubizek. Kubizek recalls the time in 1911 when he himself had been called up for service, and Hitler has strongly urged that his friend should flee to Germany.
If it was indeed his intention to avoid military service by a move to Munich, then Hitler had clearly not bargained on the cooperative relations between the authorities on either side of the Austro-German border. It didn't take long for the Austrian government to track down Hitler, and a policeman arrived at his home to inform Hitler that he was now faced with the immediate prospect of having to report for military service for the despised Habsburg Empire. Fortunately, from Hitler's point of view, the debilitating effects of his years of struggle in Vienna, combined with his poor health record, were readily apparent. He failed his medical examination, and by this stroke of what some may call fortune, he was lucky enough to be spared Austrian military service on entirely legitimate grounds by virtue of the fact that he was deemed physically unfit for the peacetime army, and he duly returned to Munich. But life in the city was about to change forever. In August 1914, the news of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand broke. There followed a few days of high tension, and then, on Saturday the 1st of August 1914, in response to the news of Russian mobilization, came the order for the mobilization of Germany's mighty war machine. The Great War had begun. Hitler, in the pages of Mein Kampf, looked back on the days of war with a warm enthusiasm and a delight that fortune had permitted him the honor of taking his place in that heroic struggle. It is no surprise, therefore, that Hitler was part of the cheering crowd in Munich's Odeonplatz, photographed by Heinrich Hoffmann on Sunday, the 2nd of August 1914. In the infamous photograph, Hitler can be clearly seen enthusiastically cheering and welcoming the news that war had been declared on Russia that very day. No sooner had the Munich crowd begun to disperse than Hitler, the recent Austro-Hungarian reject, volunteered for service in the Bavarian army.
Hitler had now joined up on the instant as a Kriegsfreiwilliger, a wartime volunteer, and to his obvious delight, he found himself properly enrolled as Infanterist number 148 in the 1st Company of the List Regiment. The explanation for this apparent conundrum, however, lies in Hitler's long political support for the greater German solution. Hitler's own attitude towards the conflict was simple and clear. He believed it was no longer a case of Austria fighting to get satisfaction from Serbia, but rather a case of the wider German peoples fighting for their own future existence. He pictured the Germanic lands as hemmed in by enemies on all sides and without the opportunity to expand horizons by overseas colonisation.
On the 8th of October 1914, the recruits took their oaths and swore allegiance to Kaiser Wilhelm II, but also to King Ludwig III of Bavaria and to Hitler's own monarch, Kaiser Franz Joseph. Standing next to Hitler was Ernst Schmidt, who would become Hitler's closest wartime companion. Schmidt was another List veteran who would later write his own hagiography, which was more acceptable to Hitler than others. The fresh warriors of the List regiment soon boarded a troop train bound for the Western Front. On the 29th of October 1914, the List regiment experienced their first action. With English shells falling all around, the battle continued for 3 days, with fierce casualties on both sides. Hitler and the First Company advanced and retreated into a storm of fire 4 times, until eventually the village finally fell into German hands.
From all the evidence available to us, it would appear that the fighting in the village of Gellerveld was the only occasion on which Hitler fought with rifle in hand. However, the brief combat at Gellerveld seems to have been enough for Hitler to distinguish himself. And it's conceivable that even during his first taste of the fighting near Gellerveld, Hitler was already being entrusted to carry messages in the field. By early November, the time of a brief action against the London Scottish near Waitscherter, he was already serving as a regimental messenger. In recognition for his service as a runner, by 9th of November he was selected to serve permanently at the regimental headquarters, and he was able to achieve the remarkable distinction of serving in that capacity and in that regiment for the next 4 years. The fact that Hitler had distinguished himself in the fighting was also recognised by him being awarded Gefreiter. The revised status brought with it a tiny rise in pay. An infanterist received 70 pfennigs per day, while a Gefreiter received 75 pfennigs.
In the Bavarian army of 1914, the rank of corporal had its own directly equivalent rank. In the Prussian army, the equivalent term was Unteroffizier. It is clearly a substantial error, therefore, to translate Gefreiter to corporal. Corporal was the lowest rank from which orders could be given to subordinates. The Gefreiter, on the other hand, had no power of command over other men. We can be certain that Hitler was never a corporal. After the brief flurry of excitement which surrounded their arrival in Flanders, the men of the List Regiment soon had to settle down to the routine of life in the waterlogged and muddy trenches, which were to become infamous during the Battle of Passchendaele. Despite all of the privations, Hitler certainly demonstrated a keen appetite for soldiering. For most men in the trenches, the lure of self-preservation outweighed the desire to serve one's country. And Hitler was different. For him, the call of duty took precedence over self-preservation. The List Regiment was his new family, and he proved himself a dedicated and genuinely courageous soldier. All of the main witnesses to Hitler's deeds in the trenches are united in testifying to the fact that he was absolutely dedicated to his duty and did not shirk from even the toughest and most dangerous assignments. However, that is not to say that Hitler was popular. Some of his colleagues recall that he was a tiresome individual. Hitler, it seems, was obsessive in his dedication to duty. Although many of his comrades appear to have held a high regard for Hitler, in typical Hitler fashion, the bulk of his own warmth appears to have been reserved not for his comrades, but for his beloved dog. There was no doubt that Hitler absolutely doted upon Foxy, a little white terrier who deserted from the British lines and attached himself to Hitler, and whose devotion seems to have been totally reciprocated. Hitler certainly commanded the admiration of many of those around him, but it was frequently a qualified admiration. Hitler, it seemed, was always too ready to launch into political tirades. He frowned on coarse soldiers' talk concerning women, objected to smoking, cursing, and was cautiously reluctant to leave the front. Hitler gave ready voice to his strong support for the war, and these opinions certainly did not endear him to those who hated the war and wanted it over, win or lose. He's described as having an innate sense for choosing the safe route through even the heaviest of shelling. He had a nose for danger and seemed to have a sixth sense which forewarned him where and when a shell was about to fall. his near miraculous powers of survival soon earned him the nickname of the Lucky Linzer.
Hitler's success in delivering even the most difficult messages and his conspicuous devotion to duty had already brought him his first medal, which was the Iron Cross Second Class, and with that came the recognition that he really craved. Hitler had saved the life of his commanding officer, and in the act he'd conspicuously risked his own life in the face of intense enemy fire. There's no doubt that the award of the Iron Cross Second Class was well deserved, and the attainment of that medal he described in a letter to Herr Popp as the happiest day of my life. And it's obvious that this small metal cross was a talisman. It provided overt recognition of everything Hitler believed in, and it encapsulated the values that he admired most: sacrifice, obedience, duty, discipline, and above all, loyalty to the fatherland. And it was in the trenches and the ranks of the List Regiment in particular that Hitler was destined to meet many of the colleagues who would form the clique at the heart of the National Socialist movement.
Hitler had no way of knowing at the time, but the German army of the Great War was outmatched and outnumbered. The German army was able to survive mainly by sitting on the defensive and attempting to grind down the Allied will to fight on. Military technology had advanced sufficiently that the attacking force was placed at a complete disadvantage. Well-planned and constructed defences, albeit at great cost, could generally thwart even the most dedicated attacker. Hitler's experiences in the trenches were therefore shaped almost completely by a long series of defensive actions. It was only in the spring of 1918 that Hitler was to experience again the brief exhilaration of a major German offensive.
The fact that Hitler had experienced so many defensive actions would have serious consequences in World War II. Based on his personal experiences in the trenches, he formed the opinion that dogged determination to hold on at all costs could be a war-winning strategy.
There is no reason to doubt the fact that Hitler was the model of the courageous and dutiful soldier. As we have seen, he had already won the Iron Cross Second Class by December 1914. And this was only the beginning of an impressive list of awards and commendations. On the 17th of September 1917, he was awarded the Military Service Cross with swords. On May 9th, 1918, he was awarded the Regimental Diploma for signal bravery in attack. And on August the 4th, 1918, he received the Iron Cross First Class. The strategic situation was becoming unbearable and something was bound to give. And finally, in November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II, invariably Hitler, came to lay the blame on the door of the Jews. And in a chillingly prophetic passage from Mein Kampf, he outlined what his solution would have been. It involved the massacre of 15,000 Jews by poison gas. It's sobering to realize that within 16 years from the date on which this passage was written, under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the actions so fervently advocated by Hitler were being turned into reality on a scale previously unimaginable.
Dachau had its crematorium too. When it could no longer handle all the corpses to be burnt, a second was built, and a gas chamber. The prisoners to be gassed were to be taken into the so-called washroom. There the doors would be shut and the room filled with poison gas. The ovens burnt day and night. But in the last few months before the rescuers came, the pile of corpses grew. There was not enough coal to burn them all. The SS put up this notice in the crematorium. Hygiene is your duty. Don't forget to wash your hands. Putrefaction hung over Dachau. Among the local population, suspicion became certainty, as they saw with their own eyes what had been going on in their immediate neighborhood.
Hitler was selected to act as a military spy. He was given the job of infiltrating fringe political parties in order to control extremism. That was his introduction to politics, and from that point onwards, he was no longer a drifter. Within a few months, he had discovered how he could take control of the tiny German Workers' Party. By 1921, the Nazi Party had been born.